They say you should never let a wild animal into your home. But what if letting it in changed your whole town? On the coldest night in decades, Jessica's act of mercy sparked ripples of compassion across Whitefish, Montana, turning fear into connection and strangers into a community. It started with one injured bobcat and ended up healing more than just old wounds. If you want to see how one act of kindness can change everything, give this video a like. And don't forget to subscribe for more heartwarming animal stories where hope always finds a way home. Because when we open our doors to the wild, just might open our hearts to each other. Asterisk, they said it would be the worst winter storm in 30 years, but nobody in Whitefish, Montana really believed it, at least. Not until the power line started groaning under the ice and the wind howled like it was trying to rip the roofs right off every home on the block. Jessica Cooper sat curled up on her sagging old couch, wrapped in a faded blue quilt, counting the seconds between the flashes of lightning and the low, rolling thunder that sounded so out of place in February. Each rumble made her flinch, and each time her mind replayed a memory, a warmer house, a deeper laugh, a presence beside her. But those days were gone now, left somewhere on the other side of her divorce, buried beneath the weight of silence and the bitter cold. Tonight, the only company Jessica had was the wind rattling the windows and the hush of snow piling up along the porch. She glanced at her phone. No messages, no calls. She set it aside, fighting the familiar ache of loneliness that crept in with every storm. She'd left a porch light burning, hoping maybe it would help her feel less isolated. But now, it only illuminated the whiteout outside, swirling flakes spinning under the lamp like lost spirits. Suddenly, a strange sound sliced through the blizzard's steady roar, something sharp, frantic, desperate. Scratching, clawing at the back door. Jessica stiffened. Her first thought was a branch blown loose, or maybe a neighbor's dog trapped by the snow. She rose, heart thudding, and tiptoed through the kitchen, careful not to trip over the rug. Bunched by the door, the scratching grew louder, more frantic, a wild urgency that made her skin prickle. "Who's out there?" she called, her voice trembling despite herself. No answer, just a whimpering. A rough yowl, barely audible above the storm. With the courage that sometimes comes from being alone too long, Jessica unlocked the back door, bracing herself against the gust of wind that nearly ripped it from her. The icy air slapped her cheeks. She peered into the swirling dark eyes, stinging as she tried to see. There, in the flicker of the porch light, she saw it, a shape low to the ground, hunched, battered by the storm. Not a dog, not even close. A wild bobcat, its fur matted and rimed with ice, crouched on her back steps. Its golden eyes caught the light, reflecting a haunting, wounded intelligence. Blood smeared its left hind leg, and its sides heaved with effort. The animal stared at her, frozen in a moment of agony and fear. For an instant, Jessica felt like she was looking into a mirror. Something wild, cornered, desperate for warmth. Her mind reeled. Logic screamed for her to slam the door, call animal control, hide in her room until morning. But a different impulse sold her, deeper held her still. The bobcat took a single shaky step forward, then collapsed against the doorframe, its breathing rough and shallow. Its paw scrabbled weakly at the wood, leaving streaks of red dot. Jessica hesitated, torn between panic and pity. She looked at the animal, then back at her silent house, the cold pressing in through every gap. She'd spent months surrounded by walls and empty rooms, learning what it meant to be alone. On the other side of the threshold, something even more alone was begging for mercy. She forced herself to breathe, to steady her shaking hands. The bobcat's sides fluttered, its ears flat against its skull, but it didn't run. Jessica wondered if it even could. For a long, tense moment, the storm and the world outside seemed to hold their breath. The snow drifted higher against her porch, and the porch light cast eerie shadows across the yard. Jessica stepped back, opening the door just enough for the animal to sense an invitation. Her heart pounded. What was she thinking, letting a wild predator inside? But some instincts are stronger than fear. The bobcat dragged itself over the threshold, a growl rumbling deep in its chest, more warning than threat. Jessica moved quickly, grabbing a heavy towel from the laundry basket and laying it on the floor. The animal collapsed onto it, claws extended, head drooping. Its breathing slowed, its eyes flickering with exhaustion as the blizzard raged outside. Jessica closed the door and slid the bolt home. She could feel the temperature drop with every second, but she barely noticed. She stared at the wild cat lying battered and broken in her mudroom. The fragile line between danger and trust stretched to its limit. In the stillness, her own loneliness seemed smaller, overshadowed by the raw need in front of her. The world. Outside was lost to snow and darkness, but inside, to survivors, one human. One wild shared a fragile sanctuary. The night had only just begun. The storm showed no signs of letting up. Snow lashed against the windows in waves, ice crystals racing across the glass, making the world outside seem like a frozen dream. Inside, Jessica paced the narrow strip of tile between the kitchen and mudroom, her mind churning with fear and adrenaline. The bobcat, now slumped against the laundry basket, barely moved. Every so often, it would twitch, the muscles in its back legs seizing from pain or cold. Blood still oozed from the wound above its paw, darkening the towel beneath. Jessica's hands shook as she grabbed her phone, desperate for help. She dialed animal control, but the call wouldn't go through. The signal flickered, vanished, then reappeared for a moment, just enough to let her try again. Static, silence. A recorded message. All lines are currently busy due to extreme weather. If this is an emergency, please. The message cut off. She tried 911, but even that failed. Somewhere in the distance, a transformer exploded with a dull boom, and the lights above her flickered, threatening to plunge the house into darkness. Jessica bit her lip, holding back a curse. She could try the neighbors, but they were a mile away through chest-high drifts. Besides, who would believe her if she said there was a wild bobcat bleeding out in her mudroom? The animal shivered, a low moan rumbling in its throat. Jessica knelt as close as she dared, taking in the mess of fur, ice, and blood. The bobcat's breathing was shallow, every inhale ragged. It smelled of pine needles and musk, a sharp tang that was at once foreign and achingly familiar. She wanted to help, but the knowledge that this creature could snap and lash out at any second was impossible to ignore. Outside, the wind rattled the screen door, and a gust sent a flurry of snow cascading across the porch. The world beyond her. Walls had become a hostile, alien place. She peered through the glass and could see nothing but swirling white and the faint silhouette of the old oak tree bowing under the weight of ice. She looked back at the bobcat, the problem suddenly overwhelming. "What am I supposed to do with you?" she whispered. The animal's ear flicked, acknowledging her voice, but it didn't move otherwise. Jessica stood, her mind racing through options. Could she make a barrier? Something to separate herself from the animal until help arrived? God, if the bobcat needed immediate care, could she really just let it die? The pain in its eyes was a silent plea, a reminder of every time she'd wished someone would see past her fear, past her walls, and offer comfort. The storm howled, and for a long minute, Jessica stood frozen in the hallway, torn between her survival instincts and the impulse to help. She remembered the first weeks after her divorce, the days when she'd barely eaten, barely spoken. She had wandered from room to room, unable to rest, unable to find peace. She understood now what it felt like to be driven from safety, desperate for warmth. Her gaze fell on the first aid kit tucked above the washer. She grabbed it, her fingers numb. She didn't know much about animal wounds, but she could at least try to clean the blood. Maybe stop the worst of the bleeding. As she moved closer, the bobcat raised its head. Baring its teeth with a warning hiss, Jessica froze, heart hammering, but she didn't back away. "I'm not going to hurt you," she murmured. "I just want to help." Her voice sounded thin, but steady. Slowly, she extended the edge of the towel, dabbing at the wound. The bobcat growled, but it didn't strike too weak, or maybe too exhausted to fight. Jessica worked as gently as she could, tearing strips of gauze with shaking hands and trying not to flinch every time the animal twitched. In the half-dark, time seemed to stretch and blur. Every small sound, the creak of the house, the moan of the wind, the snap of ice on the roof made Jessica start. She checked her phone again. No service. The battery was down to 18%. She shivered, not sure if it was the cold or the fear. The power flickered and died, plunging the house into a cold, blue twilight. Jessica groped for the flashlight in the junk drawer, relief flooding her as the beam cut through the gloom. She moved it over the Bobcat, trying to assess the wound. Blood had slowed, but the animal's breathing was still shallow, and it winced whenever she got too close. She glanced out the window. Snow covered everything, burying the road, swallowing the mailbox. No one was coming. No one could come, not tonight. She was on her own. A loud crash made her jump. The wind had knocked the recycling bin off the porch, sending cans clattering across the yard. The Bobcat jerked upright, eyes wide, a guttural snarl rattling in its chest. Jessica fell back, raising her hands. For a heartbeat, she thought it might leap at her. But instead, it sagged, defeated, collapsing again in the corner. She steadied her breath, forcing herself to think. "You're scared," she whispered. "Me too." For the first time, she saw herself not as the master of the house, but as another animal trying to survive the night. Jessica sat down, back against the washing machine, and listened to the storm. With every minute, her fear turned into something else as stubborn. Desperate hope that if she kept the Bobcat alive, maybe she'd prove something to herself. Maybe mercy wasn't weakness, but the only strength left when the world turned cold. And so, with the storm howling, the power out, and every escape cut off, Jessica made her choice. She would help this wild thing, no matter how afraid she was. If she was trapped here, then so was the Bobcat, and together, somehow, they might both make it through the night. Outside, the blizzard tightened its grip on Whitefish, swirling faster, packing snow into every crevice and crack around Jessica's little house. The world was so muffled that even her own breath sounded too loud in the dim, powerless kitchen. She sat cross-legged on the cold linoleum, wrapped in her quilt, watching the Bobcat from a safe distance. The animal's breathing was still shallow, every rib showing under its battered coat. The wound on its leg oozing only slightly now, small victory in an ocean of uncertainty. Jessica's mind drifted, as it often did on sleepless nights, back to the days after her marriage ended. She remembered those weeks like snapshots out of order, moving her boxes into the empty house, scraping ice from her windshield alone, curling up in bed and listening to the radiator knock and clatter, while she pretended she didn't care that she was by herself. Her friends had tried to help dinners out, long calls, promises that things would get better, but their warmth, it only seemed to make the emptiness at home more obvious when she finally returned. Now, the hush of the powerless house, she saw the same lost, abandoned look in the wildcat's eyes. The Bobcat didn't move much. Sometimes its tail flicked or its ear twitched at a gust of wind rattling the back door. Mostly, though, it lay curled in the towel, chest rising and falling. Its golden gaze locked on Jessica, as if weighing her intent with every second. She found herself speaking aloud, voice soft but sure. "I guess you didn't mean to end up here any more than I did, huh?" She almost smiled at the absurdity of talking to a Bobcat. But there was comfort in it, a kind of confession that the storm made possible. "It's a bad night for both of us." Her words floated between them, fading into the hum of the wind. The air grew colder, each hour dragging by. Jessica rummaged in her cupboards for anything useful: an old heating pad with a frayed cord, a battered tin of cat food from a neighbor's kitten who'd once gotten lost in her garage. She scooped a spoonful onto a plate and slid it carefully across the floor toward the animal, making sure to keep her hands well away from those claws. The Bobcat's ears perked up. It sniffed suspicious at first, then inched forward and began to eat, each movement cautious, every muscle tensed for danger. Jessica watched, fascinated by the delicate way the wildcat lowered its head, the way its whiskers trembled with each bite. It was so different from a house cat, larger, leaner, more desperate, but there was a vulnerability here too. She recognized the hunger, the raw need, the determination to survive no matter what. She let herself relax just a little, stretching out her legs and resting her head against the washing machine. The flashlight beam made strange shadows dance on the walls, and she watched them flicker, her eyelids growing heavy. Outside, the storm's fury was unrelenting. Inside, time lost its usual order. Jessica drifted in and out of a shallow sleep, jerking awake every time the Bobcat shifted. Her nerves wound tight as a violin string at one point. She dreamed she was standing on a snowy plain, a wall of white on every side. And the only other living thing was the Bobcat, pacing just beyond. "Reach," she called out, but her voice was lost in the wind. She woke with a start, heart racing, unsure if the cold or the fear was what gripped her tighter. The Bobcat lifted its head and met her gaze. Its eyes were clearer now, though still rimmed with pain and suspicion. Jessica wondered what it saw. In her enemy savior, just another animal caught by the storm? She realized with a pang that she didn't care about the risk anymore. She was invested. The creature's survival had become a lifeline, something to hold on to in a night that felt endless. A sudden banging from upstairs made both of them jump a loose shutter, Jessica realized, maybe torn by the wind. The Bobcat tensed, but didn't run. Instead, it turned in a slow circle, lay back down, and let out a sound halfway between a sigh and a yowa noise, so raw and lonely that it brought tears to Jessica's eyes. She pressed her palm to her mouth, stifling a sob. For a few minutes, she just breathed, matching her rhythm to the rise and fall of the Bobcat's chest. "I know," she whispered, as much to herself as to the animal. "I know what it's like." As the night crawled on, Jessica found herself drawn into a rhythm with her wild guest. She refilled its water bowl, careful not to get too close. She tore more strips of clean cloth, leaving them where she could reach them quickly. She counted the hours in the slow, steady movements of the cat each time it drank, each time it lifted its head. Each minute it stayed alive. There were moments of fear, when the wind screamed and the house creaked, when the Bobcat's eyes flashed in the darkness. There were moments of quiet, too, and the only sound was their breathing, and the world felt impossibly far away. Jessica started to speak to the Bobcat in a steady stream, confessing little things she'd never said aloud to anyone. "I used to hate the winters here," she murmured, "but sometimes they make me feel tough, like I can handle anything." She told it about her job at the library, about the books she loved, about the way her marriage ended with a note on the kitchen counter, and a silence that lasted months. The Bobcat listened, or maybe it just tolerated her voice. Either way, the act of talking filled the empty space, made the night a little less cold. As dawn approached, the storm's rage softened. Jessica realized she hadn't thought about the future in hours. She was here now in this moment, a woman and a wild thing, both battered, both holding out hope for the sunrise. She didn't know if either of them would make it. But for the first time in a long while, Jessica didn't feel alone. She'd given shelter, and in return, she'd found something close to kinship, a fragile, flickering connection in the heart of the storm. The storm finally seemed to let up just enough for dawn to creep in, an icy blue-gray light leaking through the edges of the windows. Jessica blinked awake in the half-dark, the quilt slipping off her shoulders, her back stiff from the hard floor. For a moment she couldn't remember why she felt so raw and exposed, until she turned her head and saw the Bobcat curled on the towel just feet away. The animal's chest rose and fell, slower now, but its sides still trembled with effort. Jessica sat up, wrapping her arms around her knees. The house was so quiet she could hear the clock ticking in the living room, and beneath it the occasional groan as the ice settled on the roof. The Bobcat watched her, golden eyes following every movement. There was wariness there, but also something softer, kind of exhausted resignation. Maybe, Jessica thought, the animal had decided she was less of a threat than the blizzard. She remembered reading once that wild animals rarely let their guard down, not even when injured. Instinct kept them alive. Suspicion was as necessary as breath. Yet here they both were, two beings battered by forces beyond their control, forced into an uneasy truce by the storm's relentless power. Jessica stood slowly, careful not to startle the Bobcat. She moved through the house in silence, checking the windows for signs of damage. Snowdrifts pressed up against the glass, and icicles hung from the eaves like daggers. The world outside was frozen, hushed. The trees bent under heavy loads of snow. No cars passed on the street, no smoke rose from the neighbors' chimneys. Everyone was locked inside their own little fortress, just like her. She made a cup of coffee on the gas stove, the only luxury left to her in the powerless house, and sipped it in the doorway of the mudroom. The warmth seeped into her, soothing. The ache in her chest. She watched the bobcat, fascinated by the way it shifted its weight, the twitch of its tail, the tension that never left its shoulders. All night she'd kept vigil, unable to sleep for more than a few minutes at a time. She'd watched the animal's fitful dreams. Sometimes its paws twitched. Sometimes it let out a low, mournful yowl that sounded too much like grief. Each time, Jessica had found herself on the edge of tears, remembering her own nights of sleeplessness after her marriage ended. Back then, she'd wandered from room to room, searching for anything that would make the loneliness less sharp. She'd always found only silence and the echo of memories. The bobcat's presence, wild and unpredictable as it was, felt strangely familiar. She saw in it the same haunted look she sometimes caught in her own reflection, the look of someone who'd been cast out, forced to find shelter where none was meant to exist. She thought about her ex-husband. How easily he'd moved on, how quickly their life together had become a closed chapter. She wondered if he ever felt the kind of emptiness that gnawed at her on nights like this, or if she was simply too sensitive, too unwilling to let go. Sometimes she envied the bobcat, its simple, animal need for survival, no guilt, no regret, just the will to endure. The hours stretched on, each minute measured in heartbeats and shallow breaths. Jessica started talking again, voice soft so as not to frighten her guest. When I was a little girl, I used to think storms were exciting. I'd watch the lightning and pretend I was on some grand adventure. She smiled, almost apologetically. It's different when you're grown. Storms just mean you're trapped with your thoughts, your memories, your fears. The bobcat watched, head tilted, as if it understood. Maybe, Jessica thought, it didn't its own way. Animals knew fear, knew hunger, knew loss. Maybe that was why it hadn't lashed out, why it tolerated her presence. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the windows. Jessica moved to sit, closer to the bobcat, leaving a few feet of space between them. She wrapped the quilt tighter and rested her head against the wall. The room smelled of snow, pine, and musk, a wild, earthy scent that grounded her in the present as the morning wore on. The bobcat finally shifted, raising its head and fixing her with a long, unwavering stare. For a moment, neither moved. Jessica held her breath, feeling the tension stretch thin between them. Then slowly the animal laid its head back down, eyes drifting shut, silent acceptance of her presence. Jessica felt a surge of relief, mixed with awe. They were still wary, still strangers, but something had changed. The distance between them, physical and otherwise, had narrowed, if only a little. It was enough. She closed her eyes and let the quiet wrap around her. For the first time in months, she didn't feel quite so restless, didn't ache so much for the past. She was here, in this moment, bearing witness to another creature's struggle, and finding in that act a kind of peace as the day crept forward. Sunlight finally broke through the clouds, casting pale gold across the snow outside. Jessica reached out, just barely brushing the edge of the towel with her fingertips. The bobcat didn't flinch, simply watched her, calm for the first time. Dawn had come. We were both still here, and somewhere deep inside, Jessica began to hope again, not just for herself, but for both of them. The blizzard had broken, but the world outside Jessica's window was unrecognizable. Drifts as high as her waist blocked the driveway. Limbs lay snapped and tangled across her yard, and the road out of Whitefish was nowhere to be seen beneath the glittering heaps of snow. The sun had returned, but the cold was sharper than ever, its pale light casting long blue shadows across the kitchen floor. Jessica pressed her palm against the frosted glass and felt the brittle chill sink into her bones. She turned back to the mudroom, her heart thumping as she saw the bobcat lift its head, alert for the first time since the night before. Its gaze met hers, sharper now, as if the animal had reclaimed a bit of its strength with the coming of daylight. The wound on its leg still oozed, though more slowly. Blood had crusted in the fur, and the animal's breathing came easier, but was still careful, measured, wary. Jessica's own nerves felt like frayed wire. Every movement she made felt loaded with consequence. She'd survived the night, and so had the bobcat, but now she faced a new kind of danger. What to do next? She eyed her phone, now barely at 10%, and saw the familiar no-service taunt in the corner of the screen. Outside world. Might as well have been another planet. She knelt on the tile, laying out the first aid kit, trying to summon the courage to do what needed to be done. In daylight, the wound was easier to see, deep, angry, a raw red slash where the animal must have been caught or cut. She wondered, with a sudden chill, if it was one of the illegal traps she'd heard people muttering about at the library, a growing problem in the wild. Even this close to town, the bobcat shifted its weight, baring its teeth in a silent warning. Jessica held up her hands, trying to slow her own frantic pulse. "I need to clean your leg," she said softly, as if the cat might understand. "If I don't, it could get infected. You'll die out here." She reached for a fresh towel and the antiseptic wipes, moving in slow, deliberate motions. The animal's muscles coiled, eyes wide, but it didn't try to escape. Instead, it watched her, each movement measured and suspicious. Jessica's hands shook as she pressed the cloth gently to the wound, biting back her own fear. The bobcat snarled a deep, guttural sound that vibrated through the floor, but it didn't swipe at her. Instead, it let her clean the crusted blood, flinching but refusing to run. Jessica wiped away the worst of the grime, her hands trembling as she worked. Each second felt like an eternity, her heart pounding so loudly she thought the animal must hear it. She wrapped the leg in gauze, careful not to tug or press too hard. Sweat prickled at her brow, despite the chill. When she finished, she retreated a step, heart racing. The bobcat let out a long, shuddering breath and lay its head back down. Its eyes met hers, and for the first time, Jessica saw not just fear or pain, but recognition, a faint glimmer of trust. Jessica sagged back against the wall, drained but relieved. She looked around her battered mudroom at the battered creature lying there and felt something loosen in her chest. They'd survived another trial together, one of intent, not just endurance. A sudden noise broke the fragile peace. A sharp knock on the door, then the sound of boots crunching over ice. Jessica jumped, panic surging as she scrambled to block the mudroom door. She could hear someone outside, shouting over the wind, "Jessica, you in there?" It was her neighbor, Tom, bundled in a thick parka, his voice booming through the storm's aftermath. Jessica cracked the kitchen door and peered out. "Tom, I'm here. Don't come in, there's an injured animal in the house." Tom's eyes widened. "You serious?" "Heard there were coyotes prowling after the storm. Figured I'd check if you were okay. You sure you're safe in there?" Jessica nodded, heart racing. "I'm all right, just trapped. Power's out, phone's dead, road's blocked." Frowned, worry creasing his face. "Saw animal control trucks out by the creek yesterday. Heard talk of traps set by poachers bastards. Caught a wolf, too. Guess all the animals are desperate." Jessica felt a jolt of fear and anger, her suspicion confirmed. She glanced at the bobcat, now watching the door with new tension. "You see anyone? Tell them to stay away from my house? And let animal control know if they ever get through. I'll be fine." "I just need time," Tom grunted, giving her a last worried look before trudging away. The silence returned, heavier than before. Jessica braced the doors and windows, fear gnawing at her. If coyotes were on the move, if poachers had set traps in the woods, she wasn't just sheltering the bobcat, she was protecting it from a world that wanted it dead. She moved through the day in a haze of exhaustion and resolve, tending to the animal as best she could, keeping the fire in the wood stove going, melting snow for water, dividing her dwindling supply of food. She felt the weight of responsibility settle over her, heavy but right. As the light faded, she sat on the floor. The bobcat's breathing now slow and steady, its gaze softer, almost accepting. Jessica leaned her head back and stared at the ceiling. "I don't know if you'll make it," she whispered, voice cracking, "but I'll do what I can, I promise." Outside, the sky darkened, and the wind began to howl once more, rattling the walls. But inside, a fragile trust had been forged one. That might be the only thing that would save them both. The night stretched on, each hour longer than the last. The coyotes circled the house, their voices weaving in and out of the wind. Jessica sat in the darkness, a kitchen knife clutched in her hand, the flashlight beam trained on the door. Bobcat crouched beside her, tense and ready, its wild instincts sharper than ever. Suddenly, a sharp bark rang out closer than before. Something scratched at the back steps. Then a chorus of yips and snarls erupted right outside the mudroom. Jessica's blood ran cold. She could hear paws scrabbling on wood, the unmistakable sound of claws. She pressed her back to the wall, pulse racing. The bobcat now beside her, a low, savage hiss rumbling in its throat, for what felt like an eternity. The two of them waited, frozen in place. The coyotes howled, frustrated by the barriers, hungry and angry. The bobcat arched its back, teeth bared, eyes blazing. Jessica could feel its body vibrating with fear and defiance. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the commotion outside faded. The coyotes moved on, their calls drifting away, swallowed by the vastness of the storm-battered forest. Silence returned, heavy and absolute. Jessica slumped against the wall, her hand shaking so badly she almost dropped the knife. She looked at the bobcat, its sides heaving, fur puffed out in a wild halo. For a moment, their eyes met hers wide with terror, the animals filled with an ancient primal fire. Jessica realized she was crying, tears slipping down her cheeks, but she wasn't ashamed. She reached out, hand trembling, and let it rest just inches from the bobcat's paw. "We did it," she whispered, voice barely audible. "We're still here." The bobcat slowly relaxed, settling onto the floor beside her, its tail curled. Around its injured leg, eyes never leaving the door, still wary, but no longer afraid. Jessica leaned back, letting exhaustion wash over her. The house was battered, the world outside still wild and dangerous, but inside, for now, there was a sense of safety, a fragile truce between two wounded souls. As the hours passed, Jessica found herself drifting toward sleep, the bobcat, a silent guardian at her side. The wind howled and the shadows deepened, but neither of them moved. They would face whatever came next, dashed together. By the time the first pale ribbons of sunlight crept into Jessica's kitchen, she felt like she had lived through a lifetime in the span of a single storm. Her body ached from sleeping on the hard floor, every muscle tense, but there was a strange, exhausted satisfaction in knowing she had made it through the night tan that the bobcat had too. The animal was sprawled in a patch of weak sunlight near the mudroom door, its chest rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm, its fierce eyes half-lidded but always alert to any sound. Jessica moved carefully, her every gesture measured too, avoid startling her wild guest. The events of the night felt surreal, the howling coyotes, the frantic scratching at the door, the way the bobcat had planted itself beside her like a silent guardian. She could still hear the echoes of those barks and snarls in the back of her mind, but here, inside these walls, there was a fragile peace. Her supplies were running low. She stared at her dwindling pantry, half a loaf of bread, a few cans of beans, a nearly empty box of crackers. She melted more snow on the stove, watching it turn to water with a kind of dull gratitude, knowing she could stretch her rations for a day or two longer, if she was careful. But she could see in the bobcat's hunched posture, the way it licked its lips and gazed out the frosted window. God, its hunger was becoming more desperate. The power was still out. Jessica had learned not to hope for the phone to work, but she checked it anyway, no signal, just the taunting symbol of a battery on its last breath. Her only connection to the outside world was the soft hum of the wind and the tracks in the snow outside her kitchen window. Telling the story of every creature that had come close to her house during the night, Jessica knew what she had to do. But the thought weighed on her like a stone. She had brought the bobcat inside, cleaned its wounds, risked her safety to protect it from the storm, and from the predators prowling the frozen world outside. But she couldn't keep it here. Not forever. It wasn't hers. It belonged to the wild, to the snow-covered woods, and the dark line of trees that bordered her backyard. She looked at its battered body, the wary intelligence in its eyes, and wondered if it would even survive out there. The sun rose higher, lighting the drifted world in a cold golden haze. Jessica bundled herself in her thickest coat and boots, then knelt by the bobcat, heart pounding. "It's time," she said softly, her voice trembling despite her resolve. "You need to go back. You need to have a chance." The animal looked up at her, understanding something in her tone. For a moment, Jessica almost hoped it would resist, that it would choose the warmth of her house over the uncertainty of the wild. But she knew better. The bobcat was not a pet. It was not hers to keep. Moving to the back door, her breath fogging in the cold air as she unlocked it, she pulled the door open, just enough to let in a rush of frigid wind and the dazzling glare of the snow. The bobcat hesitated, rising slowly to its feet, every muscle trembling. Its eyes flicked from Jessica to the open door, then back again. The air between them was thick with meaning, silent question, a moment of connection as real and as powerful as anything Jessica had ever felt. She stepped aside, holding the door open, letting the cold bite at her skin. "Go," she whispered. "You're free." The bobcat limped toward the threshold, pausing on the edge of the mat. It looked back at her one last time, its gaze clear and sharp. Jessica felt her throat tighten, a lump rising as she met the animal's eyes. She wondered if it felt the same ache she did, that bittersweet mixture of relief and loss. For a moment, neither of them moved. The world seemed to shrink down to the space between them, the open door. The line where the warmth of her house met the endless cold of the forest. Then, with a sudden burst of resolve, the bobcat stepped into the snow, its body taut with determination. It limped across the porch, leaving a trail of blood-speckled prints in the fresh drifts. Pausing at the edge to look back one last time, Jessica stood frozen in the doorway, watching as the animal disappeared into the trees, swallowed by the shifting shadows and the lingering mist. The silence that followed felt immense, pressing against her chest, vacuum left by the absence of the wild creature she had sheltered. She closed the door gently, leaning her forehead against the cold wood. Relief washed over her, relief that the animal had survived, that she had done the right thing. But underneath that, a deeper ache lingered, the sense of loss more profound than she had expected. Jessica walked through her house, picking up towels and washing out bowls, erasing the last traces of her wild guest. Every object felt changed, as if the bobcat's presence had altered the very air in her home. She looked out at the woods and found herself hoping, fiercely, that the animal would survive, that her act of mercy would be enough. The day crept forward, slow and quiet. Jessica moved from room to room, uncertain what to do with herself. She found the book she had been reading, tried to focus on the words, but her mind drifted to the bobcat, replaying the moment it had crossed the threshold, the look it had given her, the trust that had passed between them as evening fell. Jessica stood at the window, watching the snow drift lazily in the fading light. She pressed her hand to the glass, feeling the cold seep into her skin. She wondered if the bobcat was out there somewhere, curled up beneath a tree, watching her house from the shadows. She hoped it knew that, in some small way, it had changed her. And as darkness settled over Whitefish, Jessica realized she was not as alone as she once thought. Something wild and courageous had entered her life, left its mark, and returned to the world. She drew in a deep breath, her chest filled with both sorrow and a new, fragile hope. The days that followed were both emptier and fuller than Jessica expected. The storm had finally passed, leaving the landscape transformed, drifts sculpted into pale waves, trees bent beneath icy armor, and every roof along her street capped with glistening white. The sun shone hard and bright, turning the snow into a blinding field of diamonds, but the cold lingered, a reminder of just how vulnerable life could be in the wilds of Montana. Jessica wandered her yard, boots crunching through the crusted snow, surveying the damage. Broken branches littered the ground, and her garden fence leaned at a strange angle, half swallowed by a drift. She traced the path the bobcat had taken, still visible as a faint line of prints leading to the shadowed woods. Property, she paused, searching for any tuft of fur, a fresh track. A distant movement, but the forest kept its secrets.
Nice.
Silent and unmoved by her worry, her body moved through the rituals of repair and recovery, but her mind returned. Over and over to those hours she'd spent with the wild animal. She missed its presence, the watchful eyes, the subtle tension in the air. The way her world had narrowed to survival and mercy. It was strange how quickly the rhythm of caring for something else, something wounded and wild, had become part of her own heartbeat. On the third morning after the bobcat's departure, Jessica stepped outside, her breath fogging in the brittle air. She noticed something odd near the porch, a new trail of paw prints, looping around the house in wide, careful arcs. Her heart leaped. She knelt to study them, brushing snow away, until she found a single, perfect print, round, wide, with the hint of claw marks at the tips. Bobcat had returned, at least for a moment, circling its former shelter, leaving a silent message that it had survived another night. That knowledge steadied her, a comfort as she faced the long, slow process of returning to normal. The roads were still blocked in places, but neighbors began to emerge from their own homes, waving across yards, sharing news and supplies. Jessica found herself drawn into conversations at mailboxes and on snowy sidewalks, telling the story of the bobcat in small, careful pieces. At first, she expected skepticism, or even disapproval after all. Who invites a wild animal into their home? But instead, she saw wonder in people's eyes, even pride. Word spread quickly in a town like Whitefish. By the end of the week, Jessica received a call from a local wildlife officer. Her story, her frantic attempt to reach animal control, had helped them locate a series of illegal traps set just outside the town's limits. The officer thanked her, explaining that her quick thinking had likely saved not just the bobcat, but other animals as well. Crews had removed the traps, and a small group of volunteers was organizing to monitor the area. Determined to keep poachers away for good, Jessica felt something shift in her. For months, she had felt invisible, going through the motions of daily life with her head down, avoiding the pain of her failed marriage and the awkwardness of starting over in a small town. But now neighbors she barely knew greeted her by name. People stopped to ask if she needed anything: firewood, a ride into town, help clearing fallen limbs. Children pressed their noses to her fence, hoping for a glimpse of the library lady's wildcat. The boundaries between her and the world had softened, if only a little. One afternoon, Jessica baked a batch of bread and brought a loaf to Mrs. Allen, the widow 2 houses down, who'd lost power for 3 days straight. They sat together, sharing stories, laughter, and a sense of kinship born from weathering hardship. Jessica found herself talking more easily about the storm, about her fear, and her choice to help the bobcat. To her surprise, Mrs. Allen nodded in understanding. Sometimes, she said, it takes something wild and unexpected to wake us up, to remind us we're not alone. As the days passed, Jessica noticed subtle changes in the community. The town's bulletin board filled with flyers about wildlife awareness and neighborhood watches. People talked more openly about compassion for animals and for each other. There was a sense that, just maybe, they could make their little corner of Montana safer and kinder, even when the world outside seemed harsh and unyielding. For Jessica, these connections were lifelines. She volunteered at the local animal shelter, helped organize food drives, and attended her first community potluck in years. Each small act of kindness, whether it was shoveling a neighbor's walk or feeding stray cats behind the library, felt like a way of honoring what she had shared with the bobcat, of keeping the spirit of that cold, miraculous night alive. Late one evening, as twilight spilled purple and gold across the snow, Jessica stood at her kitchen window, watching shadows drift along the edge of the trees. She felt changed, not just rescued, but reborn, in a sense. Her loneliness, once a sharp ache, was softer now, balanced by gratitude and a new sense of purpose. She realized that helping the bobcat had been more than an act of mercy. It had become a turning point away to open herself to the world again, to build bridges across the gaps of fear and pain. In saving the wild creature, she had begun to save herself, and every so often, when the wind shifted and the forest grew quiet, Jessica imagined she could feel wild eyes watching her from the safety of the trees, a silent reminder that compassion, once given, could echo on, rippling out through the snow and into the heart of a community that at last felt like home. Night came quickly, turning the world outside Jessica's window to a wash of midnight blue. She sat at her kitchen table, the soft glow of a lantern painting golden circles on her journal's pages. For the first time in months, Jessica's hand moved easily, her thoughts flowing in steady, purposeful lines. She had so much to process: what she had survived, what she had risked, what she had found in the company of a wild, wounded creature. Her handwriting was a little shaky, but she hardly noticed. She wrote about the terror she'd felt during the blizzard, the way every instinct had told her to lock the door, to protect herself, to keep the wild world at bay. She wrote about the moment she chose not to listen to fear, but to empathy, the split second when she'd opened her door to the desperate bobcat and changed the course of two lives. As the pen scratched over paper, Jessica found herself circling back to a single powerful truth. Real courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was the willingness to reach across the gap, to take a risk for another, even when her own heart hammered with uncertainty. Courage was the act of offering mercy. When the world was at its coldest, she stared at her reflection in the window drawn, tired, but brighter somehow than she remembered. She saw a woman who had spent too long hiding behind walls, physical and emotional, after her husband left. She had grown expert at keeping pain at arm's length, at pretending she didn't need help, at convincing herself that it was safer to be alone. But the truth was, she had been just as lost and wounded as the bobcat, rootless, unsure where she belonged. Caring for the wild animal had forced Jessica to confront her own vulnerability. Every time she had inched closer, cleaning its wounds or simply offering warmth, she had chipped away at the fear that had calcified around her heart. She had discovered a reservoir of resilience and compassion she hadn't known she possessed. She paused, tapping her pen against her lip, thinking about the way the bobcat had looked at her, first with suspicion, then with a glimmer of trust. They had both broken their own instincts. The bobcat, trusting a human, if only for a single, desperate night. Jessica, risking herself for another, even when it would have been easier to turn away. As she wrote, Jessica realized the lesson was bigger than either of them. Sometimes survival demands that we let down our guard and accept help even when it terrifies us. Sometimes the only way forward is through the threshold of our own fear. She remembered the storm's height, how helpless. She had felt how she had wondered if she was doing the right thing, or if compassion would prove to be a dangerous mistake. In hindsight, she saw that her willingness to act despite the unknown was what had saved them both. It was not safety, but the willingness to risk for another. That had changed everything. Her thoughts drifted to her neighbors, the newfound warmth she felt in their company, the gentle pride in their eyes when they heard her story. Jessica saw how her single act had rippled outward, affecting more lives than she could count. The illegal traps had been removed. People had become more vigilant, more compassionate, more aware of the wild world that lived on the edge of their own. Jessica reflected on the nature of wounds, how they were not merely signs of weakness, but bridges to deeper connection. Her own battered heart had allowed her to care. Her suffering had been a bond, not a barrier. In her journal she wrote, "Mercy is a risk, compassion is a risk, but they are the only things that break the ice between us, the only things that make us truly human." Every act of kindness, every moment of vulnerability, brings light to the coldest season of the soul. She set her pen down, eyes stinging. She let herself remember not only the fear, but the courage it took to act. She realized she was proud of herself, not for being fearless, but for choosing to help anyway. Outside, the wind rustled the trees. Jessica stood and walked to the threshold, opening the door just a crack. Cold air slipped around her ankles, and she looked out at the night tat, the place where wildness and home met. She wondered where the bobcat was now, if it was stronger. If it remembered her. She thought about the other people in town, the ways her experience had inspired them. The kids at the library whispering about the hero bobcat, the volunteers checking traps. At dawn, it was as if the whole community had moved a little closer together. The walls between them made thinner by one night's mercy. Jessica whispered into the dark. I promised to herself and to the wild world beyond her door, I won't close myself. Off again. Not to people. Not to possibility. She closed the door softly, her heart fuller than it had been in a long way. Long time spring in Montana doesn't arrive all at once. It teases, retreats, and slowly, stubbornly begins to soften. The sharp edges left by winter. Some mornings, the world outside Jessica's window was still rimmed with frost. The trees coated in silver, but there was a new note in the airbird song, water trickling in the gutters, the scent of thawing earth. The town of Whitefish had survived the storm. So had Jessica. The months since that night had changed her, though she sometimes found it hard to describe just how. Her days had filled up with small, unexpected joys. A neighbor waving as she passed, a child's laughter, echoing from the library, the rough bark of a stray dog she'd learned to recognize on her morning walks. Jessica felt herself reaching out, joining community events. The tight knot of loneliness she'd carried for so long had begun to unravel, placed by a quiet, persistent sense of belonging. She still thought about the bobcat. In the early days after its departure, she'd found herself searching the woods, her heart leaping at the faintest sign tracks in the mud, a shadow slipping between the trees, a shape at the edge of the clearing at dusk. The memory of its wounded eyes, the way it had looked back at her before vanishing into the wild, lingered in her mind, a mixture of pain and hope. One evening, as the last orange light faded behind the pines, Jessica set out for a walk along the tree line. The snow had retreated to the north side of the house, but the ground was still damp and soft beneath her boots. She paused at the edge of the forest, breathing in the cold, clean air. It was then that she saw a flash of movement at the far side of the clearing. Bobcat stood there, stronger now, its coat thick and gleaming. Eyes sharp and wild, they stared at each other across the open space, two survivors joined by a silent bond. Jessica didn't move, hardly dared to breathe. The bobcat's tail flicked once, twice, then it dipped its head, almost as if in acknowledgement. Jessica felt something inside her crack open, a flood of gratitude, relief, wonder. For a long moment, the world held still. Then the bobcat turned and slipped into the shadows. Leaving only the echo of possibility behind, Jessica returned to her house with tears in her eyes. But she didn't feel the old ache of loss. She understood now that mercy was not about taming what was wild or holding on to what was never meant to stay. It was about offering shelter when it was needed most and letting go when the time was right. Days grew longer. The snow melted away, revealing green shoots in the garden, the first stubborn crocuses poking through the thawed earth. Jessica threw open her windows, letting fresh air and birdsong spill into rooms that had felt too quiet for too long. She greeted her neighbors by name, checked in on Mrs. Allen, and baked bread for the community potluck. She became a fixture at the animal rescue, her calm touch and steady presence, earning her the trust of creatures both wild and tame. It was during a spring festival in the park that Jessica finally found the words she'd been searching for. She was standing by the library's book table, helping a group of children choose their favorite stories, when one little girl tugged on her sleeve. "Miss Jessica, are you the lady who saved the bobcat?" Sometimes we help each other in ways we don't expect. That night, Jessica sat by her window as dusk fell, her journal open on her lap. She wrote about the blizzard, the fear, the risk, and the choice to open her door. She wrote about how courage often hides in acts of mercy, and how kindness doesn't mean trying to tame what is wild in ourselves or others, but in respecting its strength, in honoring its needs, and in having the courage to let go. Mercy is not about taming the wild, but about honoring it, offering shelter when it's needed, and letting go when the time is right. The courage to risk kindness to cross the threshold of fear is what allows healing for both giver and receiver. Each act of compassion, no matter how small, sends ripples outward, changing not just one life, but many. She closed her journal and looked around her sunlit living room. The chill was gone, the walls warmed by afternoon light. She watched the golden light spill across the floor. About the willingness to let others in, to risk one's own comfort and safety for the sake of another, and to trust that, even after the darkest storm, hope would return. And so, the story ended not with an ending, but with a new beginning. Jessica stood at her open door, sunlight warming her face, her heart ready for whatever wild, wonderful thing might come next.